Third video. All right, so
the last land battle ever fought
we-
in 1700s, I'd say yeah, they do have a.
we left off with all the attacks early on in the war, and now we're going to go to America and how we begin to change our position. So what you want to kind of be aware of now, that when the war breaks out in 39, we're slowly transitioning away from being isolated and neutral to being more helpful. So between 1939 and 1941, America is going to be convinced that we have to do something. We're not going to do what?
Go to war.
And send troops. But we'll be more and more willing to send aid and support and help in other ways with money or weapons. But we're just not going to be convinced to go to war. What will make us convinced to go to war?
Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor. So just be aware that throughout the 30s, we're neutral and isolated. The war breaks out and we begin to transition to wanting to do what?
Help.
Help, slowly but surely. And then we're not willing to fight until Pearl Harbor in December 41, right? All right, so changing U.S. policies here. So when the war began, Americans were alarmed by the Nazi tanks and planes and troops and how quickly they conquered one country after another. But it was a world away, and we felt so isolated from it that we felt like it wasn't our worry. We strongly opposed Hitler and fascism, but we didn't want to get involved in a war. FDR knew that we had to get involved at some point. FDR knew that we had to help Britain out, and helping Britain out was critical. But he couldn't convince all Americans that we had to do that right away, so he has to figure out ways to slowly ease Americans into being convinced that we should help out. So he started by tweaking the neutrality acts that benefit us to help them in some capacity. So the first thing he's going to do is convince Congress to pass a new neutrality act, often just called cash and carry. So officially this is actually the fourth neutrality act that comes out in 39. But you can just call it cash and carry, because that's what it's always referred to as. So Congress and he passed a new act in 39 to tweak the previous acts that say that we will now give weapons to countries if they pay for it in what? Full cash, and they carry it back themselves. Thus not jeopardizing any American lives like World War I. So cash and carry, the point of cash and carry is that they pay for it in full, which means that they create no what with us, no debt, and that way they don't owe us money. You pay for it in full, you take it back on your own, no Americans are in danger, so done deal, right? And we get to be okay. So cash and carry works okay at first for Britain and France, but that's only going to last so long. What's going to happen in Britain and France?
They're not going to be able to send ships and money and stuff.
Well, France won't, but Britain will. But what's going to happen over time? They keep buying stuff with playing fully in cash. They're going
They're around money.
to have more money at some point, and they're not going to have enough money to keep buying more stuff. So they're going to run into debt. So at some point, cash and carry is not going to work anymore because they're not going to be able to keep coming over here. And we already kind of know what's going to happen in Britain and France. So you know that France is going to end up getting out the war, and then Britain's going to struggle as 1940 goes on more and more. So cash and carry is good for the meantime, but it indicates that there is some beginning to shift to some feelings in America towards letting people buy them. So we're technically still neutral, right? So with cash and carry, we're technically still neutral, and we're not really involved, sort of. Then in 1940, in the spirit of preparedness, FDR is convinced to do a draft with the Selective Service Act. This is the same name of the draft act passed in World War I. They bring it back for World War II. So in 1940, Congress and FDR passed a new Selective Service Act where they'll go through and re-register men again for the draft. After World War II, they make this permanent, where now if you're 18-year-old male, you have to register for the draft. That's required by law now. Right. Well, if you want to do FAFSA, you have to do it. So if you want to go to college, you got to. Yeah. So in 1940, FDR got Congress to enact compulsory military service and got all men between 21 and 35 registered for the draft. So between 21, every male between 21 and 35 years old got registered for the draft with the Selective Service Act. Now it's 1825, but at that time it's 21, 35. Now, just because they're registered doesn't mean they get drafted. So he's going to end up drafting 1.2 million men in that peacetime. That's also significant about this act that you want to have down, that this is our first and only ever peacetime draft. So the Selective Service Act of World War II is our first and only ever peacetime draft. We've never done it before or since. Isolationists oppose this, but they're getting outnumbered. They're starting to get, by 1940, they're starting to get outnumbered. So there were isolationists who stood up and opposed this, like Charles Lindbergh, the American First Committee. They were all against this. But Americans are warming up to the idea of what? Preparedness. Not to say war, but defense, preparedness, right? We don't want to be attacked and caught off guard. The next thing that we do is we offer another deal to Great Britain. This is, as you see, during the Battle of Great Britain when things are getting tough for them. So during the Battle of Great Britain, we make another deal with them called the Destroyers for Bases deal, which does exactly what it sounds like. We give them a bunch of older destroyers, meaning like Navy ships. The USS Kidd downtown is an example of a destroyer-class ship. It's a smaller kind of battleship. We're going to give them 50 destroyer ships, ones that we had that were older, in exchange for military bases they had in the Caribbean. So we give them that in exchange for military bases they had in the Caribbean.
It said that they also got one in Newfoundland.
Could have been. But basically, British-controlled territories in the Americas. So it's a one-for-one swap, basically, meaning that there is no what created. There's no debt. We help them out, they get something, we get something, and now we're good, right? So that, again, not breaking neutrality technically, but we are helping the British out. We're doing what we can to not let them go into debt. Yeah. And again, isolation was still pretty strong, so you couldn't just give it to them outright. You had to do some kind of trade, which is what ends up happening here during this time period. Okay. The election of 1940, FDR's third election. So you get to 1940, World War II started, and FDR and his team began to mull the idea of, should I run again? We're in a crisis. We're already dealing with the Great Depression. Now we're in this crisis of potential war coming. Should you change leadership in a time of crisis? He's already done 2 terms. So he's kind of mums the word on this idea the whole year. So throughout 1940, he doesn't really make his mind up about what he wants to do. Or he doesn't really come out and say what he wants to do. So he remained ambiguous for months. So he finally decides to answer the call for his candidacy again. And Democrats were happy to support him because he was very popular. And they thought of him as an effective leader in this time of crisis. So Democrats were happy to support him for a third term in 1940. Republicans run a guy named Wendell Willkie, this guy right here. Wendell Willkie was the Republican. Wendell Willkie was a good candidate. Willkie criticized the New Deal, said the New Deal needs to basically be reduced, and spending at home on the deficit spending needs to be reduced. So he talked a lot about the New Deal, but when it came to foreign policy, everything he said for foreign policy was basically the same thing that FDR was saying. Preparedness and drafting and protection and, all this. So what's the concern in 1940? Is it the New Deal anymore, or is it the foreign policy stuff? It's foreign policy. So everybody's concerned with foreign policy, and if Willkie's out there saying the exact same thing about foreign policy FDR is, then what's different? Exactly. So they're going to go with the guy they know versus the guy they don't know. And so FDR will run and win a third term, the first and only president ever to do so. So it's not as strong as some of the other elections. He wins 54% of the popular vote and 85% of the electoral vote. A lot of folks were not happy or didn't really like the idea of having a president for a third term, which is why the popular vote's a little bit more evenly split this time around. But he wins either way because he was still very popular, and they thought in a time of crisis it's a good idea to keep the same guy in charge, and he was already popular, so FDR is able to run and win another campaign here in 1940. But now that he's won a third term, now he can aggressively push for what idea? Or what objective now? Huh? Intervention, right? Now that he's won a re-election, he can now try to push America more towards helping out Britain in this time of crisis. And that's exactly what ends up happening. Plus, the other reason why he wins too is that with all the war production we're doing now in 1940, what's happening to the economy? It's getting better. We're just about out of those high unemployment rates. So, like, the economy is doing better now underneath them because now all the war production started. So, all right. In December of 1940, he gives the very famous Arsenal of Democracy speech, that we must be the great arsenal of democracy. So, December of 1940, right after winning his re-election, FDR gives his great arsenal of democracy speech. He says America must be the great arsenal of democracy. What's an arsenal? A weapon storage, right? So who is he referring to? What people?
American people.
Just America? If we want to be the arsenal of democracy,
Okay, never mind. Yeah.
then other countries that are what?
Democratic.
Which is what example?
Great Britain.
Great Britain. So he's basically making the speech saying we must help other countries out like Britain by giving them weapons and giving them support and being this arsenal for other democracies fighting to protect democracy, which is what Britain's trying to do. Britain's trying to prevent Europe from becoming completely fascist overall. So he delivers this fireside chat saying we must be the great arsenal of democracy. And he ends any appearance of him wanting to be neutral anymore. He did it for a long time because of what everybody else wanted, but now he knows how severe things are and he doesn't come off across as being neutral any longer. The very next month, he gives another famous speech called the Four Freedom Speech. So in January of 41, he gives the very famous Four Freedom Speech. He gives a very famous Four Freedom Speech. So January of 41, he gives a very famous Four Freedom Speech. In the Four Freedom Speech, he says we must help protect countries that protect the four freedoms that we value. The freedoms are speech, freedom of worship. So we must protect the countries that protect freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want. Meaning the people in those countries do not what? If your freedom from want means people in your countries do not go what? Or like wanting for stuff, right? The people in your country, if they want food and like materials, can they access them?
Oh, yeah.
So like a dictatorship, is that always the case?
No.
No. So he's saying like if your country protects people from wanting, from having nothing, then you're good. The fourth freedom is freedom from fear. Does a democracy use fear to run itself?
No.
But a lot of times dictatorships do, right? To convince people they need to have them and everything else. So he's saying that if a country protects those four freedoms, freedom of worship, speech, freedom from want, freedom from fear, then we must help them, we must aid them, we must give them weapons and supplies. So the last thing we're going to talk about and deal with today is that those two speeches, the Arsenal of Democracy speech he gives in December, and the Four Freedom speech that he delivers in January, they all lead towards the Lend-Lease Act. The Lend-Lease Act that he is able to convince Congress with these speeches passes in March of 41. So the Lend-Lease Act is passed in March of 41. And this is going to negate cash and carry. It's going to negate some of those neutrality acts. So Lend-Lease Act replaces cash and carry in those neutrality acts. Now, based on the name, we're going to do what to Great Britain? Give them weapons, right? By lending them to them or leasing them. So which means they're going to start creating a what now? A debt. So now we're going to give them weapons and supplies, and it's okay to create a debt. So in 1941, things are getting more and more desperate for Europe, and Americans are convinced now that we have to help. We have to give them stuff, or else, because if Britain falls, who's to stop the Germans from coming here now? No one. So by 41, when it's just Great Britain, Americans are now convinced we have to do something. We have to give them supplies, and that's what ends up happening. So the Lend-Lease Act allows us to give them supplies with creating debt on their side. No more, this or that, like cash and carry. So it starts off by being given to Great Britain. Later that summer, in it's June, it's either June or July. In June, July, Hitler breaks his promise to the Soviets and Stalin and surprise attacks and invades the Soviet Union. So in the summer of 1941, Hitler breaks this promise and surprise attacks the Soviets, showing no end to his ambitions and conquest, and he begins to take over parts of Russia. And so who will also be receiving Lend-Lease materials by the summer? Soviets. And who will also eventually be receiving these materials in Asia that we're trying to help out as well? The Chinese. So be aware that Lend-Lease starts off by helping out Britain, but eventually it's going to go to the Soviets and Chinese as well too. Once the Soviets get involved in the war, because the Soviets get surprise attacked by Hitler in the summer of 1941. Okay? Questions about Lend-Lease Act or the speeches or anything else? Okay, is everybody seeing the transition? Yes? Okay. All right, we're going to stop there.